Okay, so in order to make up for having the admin day, I was going to put up a few videos. This first one, I wanted to go through just a basic process drawing. This is something I don't think we can or I can encourage enough, just kind of this workflow for those of you that may struggle or have difficulty with the drawing. So I won't do too much in the way of kind of breaking down what I'm doing in every step. Instead, I'm just gonna go through the process now, which I hope you'll have at least a passing familiarity with. And the reason cat is because now we have one recorded for a dog. I think we've done a ton of work with horses. And what we have yet is anything that's recorded with cats. And since that's a big part of what you've done this week in terms of your lecture or your feedback and character projects, I wanted to make sure we had something that was recorded so that you could revisit it even if it's a little late. So here's my gesture, working into the foreleg, chest, just the curve of that forearm that's not holding weight. I'm going to put in a ground plane just to get the perspective and placement of the back legs to feel consistent to the front. And I'm thinking, so I'm going to double check my distance. I always try to push the cats to have that longer lumbar, but I might have overdone it. I tend to do this on all my gestures, even on people, make the legs a little long. So I'm going to stop it there. This line indicates the anterior crest. And if we wanted to be real specific, we could say it's going to be higher on that side. And there's that asymmetry of position. The pelvis is high on one side, and that's countered on the forearm. And then I always work to the weight bearing side. So here I see my knee, come back. This is the lower leg. And then this is the foot. And then we'll think about that high heel idea. Remember, we think about that foot or ankle always high up off the ground. Here's a curve and rhythm for the tail. I just kind of changed it. And then for what looks like more of a stretched leg. So the reason, again, this is for that ground plane that I made. If you want, if it helps, you can relate this back. Sometimes I get awkward positioning for my legs, and so it's a helpful reminder for me. And then I'm thinking of one line. Remember, it's the as is through the knee down to the foot. And I have a good idea of where that should end so that it feels like it's foreshortening and not unrelated to the rest. So that's a gesture. Don't have to go too much farther than that. Now let's layer it so that if you would like any of these files, you can take them apart and look at them. And then we'll turn down that stage so that you can see how it might be beneficial in working through some kind of a more structured character piece. It would require you have to use similar stages or steps. So now I'm going to look at landmarks. Maybe we'll keep it at this point. All right, so the landmarks that I'm going to use, at least for the setup here, was shapes and then connections before landmarks. So the connection here between the neck and the rib cage is always defined by those C and S curves. So this might be C. This I'm thinking of as an S. Oops, it's looking a little light. Okay, now what is that connecting to? Well, I want to put my rib cage or indicate for my rib cage here. So if we think about where that spine is, which is always lower or inside of the contour or the profile, we would see the spine cervical to here. I'll try to be a little bit more specific with some of the bones so you can see maybe how the construction will result on top of them. Thoracic is this. And then we have this kind of big arching lumbar, which is taking us into the pelvis. So first, rib cage, we said we'll have that spinuous process, just like a horse, except it's not as high. And that goes down in kind of a wave pattern. So it's high near the shoulder, lower towards the center and lumbar, and then it gets slightly raised again nearer to the pelvis. So that's the spine, just like ours. Ours has something similar. And then rib cage, here's the thing in the front. That means that this line, or a little shape I'm making there, is the sternum, goes down, and then starts to come back up. So we could think of the rib cage in cats as more of a teardrop kind of shape. And I'm thinking of this all turning under, right, so that we get the sense of it as a volume. So that's how I'm thinking of the head connecting through the neck into the rib cage. The pelvis, any number of ways is acceptable or fine to draw the pelvis. It could be just to kind of put up a few variations here. The sphere, if you're comfortable with this, and then starting to tilt it and then move it. It could be a small thin box if you want to do something that's more specific to the pelvis. Right, so let's just start with that. Another alternative that I think looks really nice is if you're comfortable with perspective and want to be a little bit more accurate, you could make a box and then put a bit of a C curve on the front. And this would be a way to indicate for how the kind of the bottom portion of the pelvis pushes out. So it'd be like an organic solution to thinking about the more rigid architecture and skeletal structure of the pelvis, which would look more, if we did a basic box again, a more directly skeletal visualization of this would be that. These are the crests of the pelvis. So it's the anterior superior crest. Probably heard about that in a human anatomy class. And then the ischium pulls back like that. The leg sits right in there. And you have kind of the opening and the movement down towards the ischium. So depending on your level, anything is fine, right? But they all basically mean the same thing and allow you to visually represent the same thing. So let's just work with that one since I have it there, and then we could maybe gradually build over into that. Okay, right in here is where I can kind of make out that as is. So I'm gonna visually think about that there. That's what I'm aiming to get with this landmark stage. But last thing I need to do is connect. So you're gonna put a S curve to show how this, which we now know is the abdomen and the oblique, is stretching. Done, right? So now I'm all done with my landmark stage. Let's just put a few landmarks in the head so that we can get a sense for how the basic structure of this skull is going to sit. So let's do a center line. And I think first, since I know there was some confusion over the cat head, why don't we draw a skull first, and then over that I can construct out how I would normally think through the simplified planes. So we'd have the basic ridge here of the skull. On the other side, I'd be thinking of the brow line or the eye line here. That's the ridge of the brow. Here's the kind of little corner or that open area that I know I've talked about of the eye socket. In other words, the incomplete socket or temple, missing temple. Here it is on the other side. And then if you kind of look at the eye socket, it'll just flow back into the cheek structure. And so you could make a C curve here for the idea of that cheek. Here's the kind of the whole of the cranial mass or brain case, and then down into the nasal area and mouth. So this would be where I'd later represent that kind of ramping plane, and from there we would be into the nasal structure. So here's the housing, or in the figure human skull, this is called the saddle, the nasal saddle. So I'm thinking of this as kind of under where the placement of the nose would be. For cats, to make it a little bit shorter, kind of like something like that, like a little tiny piece of toast. And then from there, we could think from a rhythm, or I'm just drawing a rhythm down from the corner of the eye. That gives me my basic structure for that top plane. If you do one slightly lower than that, that would be where the canine sits. And that's a fun way to try to work into the separation of the front of the mouth versus the side of the mouth, is to find a canine. So that would be where the kind of the large tooth is in the front, have a slightly end of the top of the mouth with the teeth, and then we'd have the back or the um, lower jaw. So that, and then turn it down. So a really simple skull setup, just so that we could maybe take a look later at how the idea of head construction will simplify this. So that's all I need. Now let's set up some of the bony landmarks in the body. Just to be really clear, scapula. So we know scapula is the shoulder or the shoulder blade. And because there's so much weight on it in this, here you can see how it's peaking or pushing up above the contour of the back. And so I'm going to move mine maybe a little bit more so forward. So here, and it could be a triangle shape or triangle plus a curve like we talked about it in class, as far as how it represents a form language that resonates with the larger structure of the cat. And then on top, we could make what's called the spine of the scapula, which is just going to be like this little notch or plane that sticks out in the middle and helps divide muscles top to bottom for how they work or move the arm. Under that is where the head of the humerus would begin. So that's that ball and socket joint. And that would be in this area here. So scapula down, ball and socket back to the angle of the humerus. And this is that arrow shape that I talked about. So humerus we could think of as a longer S curve. So that's just looking like this. And then at the bottom, it becomes more so of a hinge. So ball and socket to hinge. Here's my hinge structure idea. And I'm just dropping this slightly below the rib cage. On the other side, we might have a harder time seeing this. So it looks like if I were to draw through scapula, so here, head of the humerus goes back. Hinge joint would be somewhere back here. So this one, I'm trying to visualize the idea of it having moved forward, and then this one conversely somewhat back. The forearm, before we move into the structure of the pelvis and the legs, I would put two bones here. Fitting into that hinge joint is the ulna, and that goes straight down. So larger at the top because it's creating that hinge structure. And then the radius sitting in front, crossing over to the inside. And this is that idea for pronation that cats, monkeys, us, and a few other animals will have. So that is forearm. And then for the basic structure of the hand, one thing to remember is the asymmetry of the wrist, which you can kind of see here, that high to low. So here we could fit in the carpal idea, maybe just like a rounded shape, and then down to the bones of the palm. So here's the palm, and then once we're here, we'll start to see the fingers come out, down, and then up or forward, depending on what the claw's doing. And this is that digitigrade stance that I've been trying to emphasize for cats, right? So that nobody stands on the flats of their feet. And then here for this one, let's just make a gestural indication of this hand. Wrist is here, and then that hand's moving back. So there's the front of the cat, and now let's start to work our way into the pelvis. I'm going to clean up this ribcage design a little bit just to thin it. Too barrel-like towards the bottom. That's coming up in here. And I think this is all still landmark stage. gesture, tilts, shapes, connections, landmarks, and now let's put in some descriptive landmarks for the pelvis. So I'm starting with this shape, and what I'm doing on top of it is just saying, okay, well, if that's my shape, I see a point here, or a light and dark shift, and then on the other side, I see something that's peeking up behind the loins. So that's that muscle group we talked about that's right in here. That gives me my landmark points to set up a box. Right, so actually I'm going to move this one out some, overshot it. Let's say it's there and here, but I don't want this to be too wide. Right? A wide pelvis would be a stable animal, like a horse. Once I have this, then what I can do is I'm going to use that to get here. Right? So these 2 points are these 2 points. So from that, all I have to do is drop a height, a width, and a depth. Once you have those 3, all you have to do is just go on autopilot and copy paste the rest. Okay, so here's a basic idea for a pelvis. And if you wanted, you could get super fancy and on top, try to thin it a little bit more. Put that little half cylinder, right? But that would be one way you could help think about where muscles are going. If a representation of a bone helps you to think about where you put the abs, for example, right? The abs would go right into the top of that. Okay, now think 2/3 of the way down. Carve out a little area or cavity, and that's where the femur is going to go. So designing a femur, head of the femur, great trochanter, femur. And I want to double check here my distance and my heights. So usually we'll see the knee a little bit lower than the ankle. And so that's okay. Same setup in terms of the design of the leg, hinge joint, just like ours. Patella, tibia, fibula. And then hinge joint for the ankle, calcaneus, tarsus, and then the toes would be the same. So that's done. This side, I would be seeing, because the knee would be behind, I would be seeing there the tibia, hinge, and then foot. And toes. Okay, so a lot of work. Takes longer, partly because I'm explaining it. Now let's do a construction over that, and then the last thing that I'll do is just quickly wrap anatomy. That way, if you were unclear with any of the muscles that we did, you could see it on that. But this will stand as a loose reference point for any construction. So let's do a different color. Okay, so let's start with the head and work our way back. So in developing the basic idea of the head, you didn't have to do nearly as much as what I did. All I asked was that you try to visualize or think of the structure of the skull as a box. This is kind of a, just because it's a more predatory design. The herbivore we looked at has a sphere with that long snout. But dogs and cats, I'm going to design this the same way. But notice that I'm building the box off the corners of the eye socket. And then I'm dropping it down to kind of exclude, at least in this representation, any of the nasal structure. So that's just kind of cranial area and cheek, and it's summarizing that much. From there, I said, if it makes sense, just think of a mailbox in front. And then use this to determine the proportion of the snout or the nose and the mouth. So maybe it comes forward about that much. Now I can line this up here, and what this plane does gives me the turn of the cheek or bottom of the eye socket. Right? And all of these points line up on that line. Same thing over here, or all of these points, top of the brow, bottom of the socket, bottom of the cheek structure as it flows into the mouth. You can do the same thing over here if it helps. And then you can take this and just kind of shave it out or flatten it. And that gives you two forms, which I think are useful in cats because since their heads are always low, it can be difficult to see the foreshortening at times in that area. And now we'll just put on some, so let's just put on some fancy detail. So let's get it darker. So this would be maybe taking this and making it feel more organic. Fancy detail could include, actually, why don't we do this larger? I'm going to do this over here, just so, in case some of the things I'm saying are too abstract or feel like they're unrelated from what I'm drawing, you could see more of a one-to-one, right? So that I don't seem like I'm entirely just making it up. Okay, so that's the basic structure. On top, we're just going to build out some of the form qualities that will help it resonate as something more organic or feel more organic. So in doing that, what I'll be looking for would be to add the ramp. That's one of the initial secondary perspectives that helps integrate a lot of these larger ones. And that's this shape. So like you took a little door wedge and then just built it across here. This would be kind of like the keystone in a human portrait. That bone that sits between the sockets that leads down into the nasal saddle. So here's a center line. Use that as a symmetry line of the face. That way you can judge proportions and foreshortening on either side. And then let's put on a nose. That's working down. So this is the septum of the nose. You can start up here. And then how it gives this rounded quality to the top of the mailbox. That's something I try to think about as secondary. Right? So that I have imagined putting like a shaved or part of a cylinder over this. And so it's building just that much over the top of that structure. And then when it turns the plane, I can let that fall a bit into the design of the nose right here. And I think that's always much more triangular in cats. So it looks like this. Have the nostril moving up here. And then when it turns the corner on that mailbox, I shift the line down. And then here's my triangle shape. For the eyes, before we get down into the mouth, you could think of the eye structure here. So one thing I'll do with the eyes often is just lay in a sphere first. So here's a ball, right? And then I could kind of work the design of some of the anatomy or ideas that we've discussed so far around it. And even though it was brief, we did talk a little bit about the nasalis muscles, which are muscles that would flow from up here and then down. So this is how I would use some of these planes that I set up to understand anatomy, okay, because every line affects the way that an anatomical piece flows across that surface. And that's something that we've been talking about with our muscle shapes. So that piece looks like this. You can see kind of muscles. Over this would be the whisker bed. I know we've talked about that. Once this is done, this also gives me this kind of transition plane, or that nice leaning plane off the side of the mailbox. So I'm filling in some of the more organic aspects. The eye, you can think of that principle that we talked about on the human, that canthal ligament. That would be part of what gives this dark connection down here. Moves up around the eye itself. And then because the head is bowed, we see the eye kind of look like that, wrapping that way. And then as soon as it hits the form, it wraps around the ball and then down. So that's my basic eye shape. And then we could see there's that really cool looking light coloring under. And then over, we can put some of these fattier, softer shapes. This looks like there's this little comma shape right in the corner of the brow. Same thing would happen over here. I'll just leave it partly laid in here so you can see the stages. Basic sphere, cheek. That would be my setup prior to adding any of the design for the features. And then cats have an orbicularis, a muscle that tightens their eye that sits over it like a monocle, just like we would. Directly under this, so you can see all this dark that's starting to form, that's the pole of the bone. And so now that cheekbone or the thinking of the skull has some value and then pulls down into the face. Right? But as it makes this transition here, it takes on, or it can, depending on the lighting, it can take on some value. Right? So I see some value under the corner of the eye and then partly under the cheekbone itself. Okay, let's start moving our way down since we have somewhat developed eye into the mouth. Mouth is always a peace sign. So there's the start of it. Pull out to the mailbox, to that corner. So that's just a template. I obviously don't want to draw a cat head as a mailbox and then try to show people. I'm using it as like training wheels. So that's the kind of the fullness of the whisker bed. Just think of that whisker bed on top. Think of it this. And then all the, if you were to draw in whiskers, they always go in a pretty organized line. Okay, so that's that fullness to the end of the mouth. And then if you look at the corner of the lip there, it's very commonly under the eye. And so that'll be something that's like people too. Like the corner of the mouth lines up with the center of the eye. And just so you can see it without my scribbles on it. So that's where this line falls to once it hits that corner. That way I don't have happy smiling cats. So I want this to feel like it's kind of sagging, and then I'll bring it back up. Here's the chin. I always push that out a little bit. And then let's consider some of the anatomy that would help the jaw feel realistic. In terms of additional muscles here, if you're struggling with this idea, the idea of that mouth that kind of sags down, one way you could think of it is that the muscle that connects to that is that zygomatic major comes all the way from up by the ear. And it's a thinner muscle. And even though it can help pull this area, it doesn't have a massive influence at rest. Right? So it does have this feeling like it's sagging down. It might be overly complicated, but you never know. So oxygenator, if we think about a secondary shape, one way to generalize what's happening here would be a simple egg, like that. And then behind that, or kind of maintaining the majority of this portion of the box would be masseter. Right, so that's here underneath, and then all of this I'm thinking of as that giant, powerful muscle of mastication. And that's going up to the underside of the cheek. Cheek there. Let's put on an ear for good measure. If I can find the cheek here, one thing I always try to do with the ear is use it to slice part of the box. Because again, I don't want people to see this rigid cube, right? It's a means to an end. So the ear is an opportunity to start to carve or customize that. With the cat, with the horse, we went through a process of cutting out the whole side plane. And that's something you can also do here, right? All of these steps are related and interchangeable depending on what you find to be useful, what matches with your drawing style, etc. So here's the ear, in other words, if you did go through this process, relates to that plane, right, by way of the line making an exact kind of transition across it. But then the ear also kind of folds and wraps with the back of the head. So I think that's an important rhythm, because sometimes I'll draw cats and then my ear looks like it's just hanging off the side unrelated, right? It'll just look like, boop. Right? So I want to make sure I get something that feels connected. And then once I have this, you think of it as a base or an elliptical or cylindrical base. And then I develop an ear shape up from there. With cats, I would try to keep it somewhat conical, not too sharp. But I'll use this idea, right? Because now it looks like it's turned back. But if I think of it from a different angle, right? Here's the same start. If the ear were turned forward, I would use this shape, same shape more or less, and then open it, right? By way of showing a thickness and then an inside. And so that helps me to turn the ear. It gives me latitude in turning the ear. Okay, so not exactly like what we're seeing, but a process of head construction in a generic sense that'll hopefully help you make sure that you're able to break down any number of feline-based animals. So with that in mind, let's return to a basic structure for some of those larger volumes. We have a head, and you know how I'm starting it. Now, one thing that would be good to do is develop a tombstone. So we talked about how you can, if you want, to give variations on the tombstone, showing one side higher, one side lower. I think you could really, in most cases, just keep it the same. The benefit to me here is that when I get comfortable with this is a design, a few things happen. One, it becomes shorthand for all the bones. Right? So you see how all my lines, point of the shoulder, elbow, same on that side, up, top of the spine, over, scapula, scapula ends, falls back to elbow. Right, so the tombstone is summarizing a lot of the work that I did earlier that I don't want to do every time or won't have time to do every time. Second, it gives me a nice connection for the perspective of the neck. So now I know exactly how to think about this, and then furthermore, I know exactly how the muscles should relate. So one thing that I see in some characters or creatures is that the body flattens out. And sometimes that's because these planes are missing, right? So back over the neck, down across the tombstone, back over the rib cage, between, behind the rib cage and pelvis, right? So if you can get comfortable enough with these to just indicate these planar transitions, it's going to make a big difference. Here's a basic cylinder structure for this. And then I think with the cats, I mentioned that a deck of cards is pretty effective. So if you wanted to make this a deck of cards, that's the same perspective idea that I'd use for a human hand too. And then if we were going to do anything to work on the fingers, I would do, we draw a finger out here, proximal, knuckle, middle, knuckle. And then I know we talked about the fingers or the nails, and that how this part, which is the distal phalanx, is also the nail and can be retracted, right? If a ligament pulls on it, and extended if the ligament pulls on it. So you could do that, or I think I also recommended that you just kind of make a governing or a larger tombstone-like design, small tombstone-like design there. So either one works. Really, it's your choice. Same thing here though. Put another cylinder from that point of the shoulder that comes forward and then turns. So there's my cat structure. And now pelvis is really kind of done, or it's close enough. So I'm going to do connection. Let's give a better structure here just for the box. Clean it up a bit. Here's the top. I'm just kind of relating these planes of the box up into the back. And then for the whole of the leg, what a lot of people do, or what we talked about in class, is just making a big egg shape that ties all of the knee and hip as one volume or one structure. And then you could give this a mass by giving it a corner. So thinking of this as a front to that shape. And then this would be a cylinder. And then into the foot would be that deck of cards idea as well. The deck of cards there, gets a little hidden in the grass. Transition rhythm, so you can see this area of skin that pulls in from the front of the knee. That's what I would use to try to tie this together in a more visually appealing or curved way, like gesture. And then cylinder back here. And then that's a structure. Right, so this would be a basic construction buildup for a cat that I'm now going to put on some muscles, or at least to bring us up to speed with things that we've discussed in terms of the cats. Okay, so let's do this. Let's turn this down, and then let's make all the other layers also kind of ghost away. Oops. That way we can just focus on trying to see and think anatomy. And that'll be our last part. Okay, so that's probably good enough. And now we're going to wrap some of those muscle shapes, just like we did for the horse and the dog before. So we're going to use red to do that since it's all muscle now. And I'm going to start with the neck and then just work my way down. So we'll do this a little bit larger. And I'm only focused here on the torso. Okay, so first things first, what I want to do is we're just going to start from front to back. So brachiocephalicus is the first one. Basic generalized shapes of muscles here would be temporalis. Underneath that, masseter. So if you want to keep it really simple and just kind of think as the most basic pattern, that's what I've been trying to get you all to do. Here is the brachio. It's just kind of slightly behind the skull there. And then pulling down. So this line comes around the neck. Basic volume there. As soon as it pulls down, hits this corner of the tombstone. When it hits the corner of the tombstone, it pulls back. And for now, I'll just try to place it on this front corner. When we start to get into the muscles of the arm, it'll get somewhat hidden. Back up, build a thickness for this, and then show it get thinner as it pulls down. Done. Slightly in front of this, we'll have the muscles of the side. In the horse, we called it the sternohyoid. This one is going to where the sternum would be. So we'd imagine that there, somewhat in the center of that tombstone shape. That's done. When we had these, the next thing we did was made a transitional triangle, right, that moved from the throat into that hyoid section when we compared it to our necks. Make this one a little bit bigger. And then all I have to do now is try to show this on the other side. So we can make a equivalent shape there. And then I'm thinking of a muscle from this other side that comes down. So I want you to remember these basic shapes primarily because when it comes to developing preacher or when it comes to making anything that isn't some kind of basic, boring anatomical chart, you're going to have to be able to think of shapes moving, right, to reposition a figure. Now that I'm here, one thing that we remember from figures always is pectoralis. And so the pectoralis sits in the bottom of that tombstone. So that line is bringing out or trying to remind me of where that tombstone is. And then we would see from this point, pectoralis going back, and then it's going to overlap. So this shape right here is pectoralis. You're going to see it on the other side as well. And remember on the horse, we said it kind of looks like abs in this area and that there's a number of them. So we start to see them pull under or turn away. The other thing that I'll see with the pectoralis is it's going to pull back quite a ways. So you usually see it behind the shoulder. Why don't we take a look and see how well we see that on the cat? Yeah, we just see hair kind of or fluff in front, but that whole recessive plane is this principle. So you put it in shadow so it turns back a bit, but the pectoralis is always on the bottom of the tombstone. Next thing is trying to think a little bit about the remaining shape here of that chest or pectoralis. I'm just going to peek it out right behind the tombstone there. So that's the neck, right? We have all of those muscles dealt with or worked through. One thing now we can look at would be the muscles that we talked about on the torso. One of the first ones would be that loins, or the shape of the loins. So for this guy, let's take a look and draw it on him. It's this. Right, so this shape is the spinal erectors, right, the corn dog equivalent in the human. So for the cat, I'm going to think of the spinal erectors as pulling up from here. And like you could see, what I started to do in this one is use it as a way to define the top plane, right, of the back of the pelvis there, and then the lower back. So if you were to imagine the corn dog shape, it would be kind of branching and moving up into this section, which is great, but you don't see any of it. So the area that's useful is this, and then the other thing I'll do is turn it and use this area as an expression of volume. And that would be kind of just slightly below the as is. Okay, so that's pulling up. If we were to find or reassert that spine in the middle, give one shape spine and then the other shape in this symmetrical muscle group. So that's a very plainer way to visualize the spinal erectors. It gives you that transition from top of pelvis to top of rib cage. Otherwise, we talked about the abdomen, very difficult to see, but would be attaching to this point and works well enough as your basic S curve of the underside, or C curve if there's some kind of a run. So that's all I would do there. The last muscle that we talked about was the oblique, right? So the externus oblique is going to be a pretty big one for the cats. Again, we're going to be minus a lat here, so we're having to just kind of think about the part we would draw. A lat, which we'll talk about in the next video or meeting, is going to be all of this line. So big line pulling down and grabbing the humerus. So it'd be something like this. Right, the line here is meant to show a curvature of the rib cage to communicate the form under. So with the oblique, just like in humans, next to the pectoralis, or to the side of it, I should say, pulls up, back, and then I just kind of butt it up against the spinal erector or the loins there. And the expression of the parts, or if you were to see it, has these repeating spokes. So spokes just to maintain some kind of animated visualization. And that would represent here the side of the waist, or you could also think of it as an integration of the side of the pelvis, which is back here, into the side of the rib cage. And every muscle, at least in these transition or connection areas, is about establishing continuity between the larger masses and planes of perspective. Okay, so hopefully that helps. That's just a review, more or less, for process and then for muscle shapes over.